We're back, people. Talking Thrones, Season 2 premiere, Episode 11 overall of Game of Thrones, Season 2, Episode 1, The North Remembers. Pat, you ready to get this going?
Yeah, man. Hopefully we remember how to do this thing, you know?
Way to inspire confidence there.
No. Hey, listen, the North remembers, but we're going to have to figure out if we know how to do this show on Talkin TV, right?
I guess we're going to find out. Stay tuned, people. We're back. It's Talkin Thrones. What's up, Pat?
Hey, nothing much, you know, besides basically having the YouTube feed go off and distract me a little bit during the opening. That's, hey, listen, it happens. What can I say? Like I said, it happens. So what did you do with your last couple weeks here?
You mean with my week off? Well, I went to Jamaica. I got a tan. I got sick. What's it called? I watched some really bad movies because I'm not going to lie, July has been a pretty terrible month for movies, but I'm excited. I'm glad to be back with Game of Thrones. Honestly, it's funny because like I said, we pre-recorded the finale for season 1, so even though it's by YouTube's release standard, it's only been 2 weeks since our last episode. For me, it feels like it's almost been a month because we recorded the final 2 episodes of season 1 back to back. So it feels like it's been a really long time. And so when I watched the season 2 premiere this morning, I was just so happy to be back. I'm like, oh man, I've been missing some quality in my life, so I'm glad to have something of
Dom, I feel like I watched like season 2 and 3, and then I had to go back and watch this episode again.
Man, you got to do it week to week.
I know. I'm doing it week to week. I'm watching every episode, basically the morning of the podcast, and then basically discussing it with you. But the thing is, I think season 2 really got to me. Like after, seeing some of the, basically Ned Stark getting axed, I had to go forward. I had to watch more episodes. And I got through season 2, and it was like, I can't really be stopping. And so, it's one of those things where this is definitely a binge-worthy show once season 2 hits.
Yeah, season 2 is definitely where the binge, if you will, begin. The bingeability for this show really begins, right? We talked about it. Season 1 is kind of helped by the binge, but season 2 sets a lot of kind of micro trends that even though season 1 sets in line all of the story threads, right? Season 2, I feel like, is what establishes a lot of the trends going forward, right? We have the premiere trend that starts, obviously the penultimate and finale trend that kind of starts. We have a lot of the isms that would become established. A lot of the memes, a lot of the kind of the more memorable lines, a lot of the memorable moments that get referenced. A lot of those get established in season 2. But we have a lot of stuff to cover as far as with what this premiere has to handle. As far as we are introduced to so many different new settings, so many different new characters. All of them. All of this stuff is just constantly thrown at you, and you're kind of realize, oh yeah, we're in this world now. And so the thing that I'll say, though, to kind of kick off this podcast, as far as the difference between the odd seasons and the even seasons, right? So we know that the odd seasons are typically more so geared towards setup, and the even seasons are geared towards action. That's why, with the exception, I feel like, of the last season, there's overall a lot more positive feeling towards seasons 2, 4, and 6, rather than seasons 1, 3, and 5. I find season 3, with the exception being the Red Wedding. But the thing that we're gonna see as we cover this season going forward is that Ned Stark's death certainly did spur a lot of events in motion, and there are going to be a lot of things that happen, a lot of action that happens this season, a lot of character portrayal that happens this season, a lot of character growth that happens this season, and a lot of stuff that continues to push our story forward. So, Pat, you have anything else that you wanted to say before we get into what actually happens in this episode?
Hey, listen, I'm just going to jump right into what I find kind of slaps you in the face in this first episode. And that's how much of a, a-hole Joffrey is.
Yeah, Joffrey sucks.
He's not going to get any better.
As if the last season didn't reinforce that enough. The opening scene of this episode, which again is entitled The North Remembers, this is the third episode, directed by Alan Taylor, written, of course, once again by Benioff and Weiss. And we're on Joffrey's name day. We don't know how much time has passed between the ending of the first season and the beginning of this season, but I have to assume it hasn't been that much. You know, like Westeros time is really weird relative to our time. But it starts off literally just with, of course, Joffrey doing what you know, of course, what any like precocious like 14-year-old, I think he's supposed to be like 14 or 15 for his name day here, it would have done, which is just having just knights beat the shit out of each other and just murder each other.
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to like what he views as being a king, and that is if I show that I'm ruthless, that basically people will fear me. And, you know, it's one of those things where he's young. He doesn't really understand how things work. Clearly. He doesn't understand how to invoke fear from people. And to a certain degree, like peasants and whatnot will be fearful of a guy who's sort of, you know, axing people's heads off. And,
right. And ripping their tongues out and
exactly.
all the heinous stuff.
For the most part, you know, as we progress through this season, we're going to learn that, you know, fear turns towards a little bit of anger, and it's not the right type of fear that he's invoking. And exactly. It's really his naivete that is, you know, basically blinding him. And any of these scenes where we're seeing the Hound just like throw someone off the top of a building during a joust, and it's, you know, basically we have I forgot what the knight's name is, but he shows up at so Dantos shows up with like 2 drinks in him, and then Joffrey takes offense and basically decides.
I don't know. I don't know about you. I got the sense it's a little bit more than 2.
I feel like, you know, he has to be an honest knight, and he said 2 drinks, so I'm gonna have to believe him on this because
the last honest knight in Westeros.
Well, he's got to be, right? You know, maybe he embellished a little bit, maybe 3 drinks. But like the fact is, you know, what Joffrey does, basically hold him down, you know, shove the wine in his throat. It's like Joffrey is not going to win over any fans at all during his reign. And ultimately, you know, I think we mentioned this either last episode or 2 episodes ago. You know, it's the people in this show that don't really play the game, you know, that basically end up slaughtered. And I think, you know, Joffrey basically doing his own thing, being this horrific, sadistic guy, is basically him not really playing the game properly. And that ultimately leads to his downfall, which is seasons away. But like, we have to keep an eye on this. You know, it's how bad Joffrey plays the game.
Absolutely. It's definitely going to be worth noting. Obviously, we know that seasons 2 and 3 see Joffrey at its worst. Season 3, less so because he's not torturing Sansa as much. But this season, we're going to see some awful, awful moments from Joffrey, particularly at the end of this episode. But what I wanted to do kind of for the purposes of this episode is the thing about like these Game of Thrones season premieres going forward. You know, we obviously had the pilot last season, which was just setting everything up and just, you know, getting us reoriented to the world of Game of Thrones. But I kind of wanted to do similar what we're going to do with finales going forward, which is kind of just do a play-by-play recap of all the characters and kind of where they're at as far as in their journey, kind of at the start and the end of each season. And so we're going to do that for this premiere as well. So we hit Joffrey, obviously, and then, of course, we have coming in to save not only the scene, but also the season is somebody who was being geared towards it, and we're now in it. This is the MVP, let's call it, of Tyrion Lannister. Like, this is Tyrion Lannister having his MVP season. I don't know sports terms, so I don't know, but let's call it, I don't know, would you chalk him up to the Hall of Fame in this season, or not yet?
Well, Hall of Fame is long term, and as we all know, Tyrion gets to decide the fate of Westeros, even though he's a prisoner.
That's true.
So
that's true.
I guess he is the Hall of Fame, but
yeah, I guess
he's definitely the most valuable player here in this season.
Yes.
And it all starts with him coming in and him basically sort of saying, "Hey, celebrate your name day. I got business to take care of." And he just kind of wanders off into the chamber of the
small council chamber.
Yeah, the small council chamber. So
yeah, dealing with very pivotal matters of discussing whether summer is at an end and whether they have enough wheat to get through it, and, you know, the amount of refugees that are coming into the city, and of course, what is Cersei doing? Just basically ignoring most of it. You know, it's funny how we criticize, you know, Robert a lot for some of his inability to rule last season, but obviously he knew that when the chips were down and how to handle the important things. But this is kind of the beginning of a long trajectory that shows that Cersei may not be as equipped to rule as she thinks she does. And in strolls in Tyrion, who, of course, this is like a nightmare scenario for Cersei. This really is, because Her father's not here. Her brother/lover has been kidnapped. Her eldest child is on the throne, which she originally thought was going to be a great idea, but it is slowly turning out to be an absolute disaster. And now in comes her little brother. And if there's one person outside of Tywin Lannister who possibly hates Tyrion almost as much as he does, it's Cersei. And when, of course, not only does he waltz in, basically state that Tywin has made him Hand of the King, and then basically point out all of the ways in which she is screwed up in the previous season, basically saying,
am I imagining this, Dom? But doesn't Tyrion give Cersei a kiss or at some point?
He does. He kisses her on the cheek when he first sees her.
It's really absurd.
I believe the line is ravishing as ever, which I mean, this is a family that we know commits active incest, so I don't know how I feel about that.
Well, just how much they hate each other, and this is the nicety that they show in front of the other, advisors. And I think it's one of those things where Cersei wants to really rule, and I think she might be right in this case, where it's like, hey, let the peasants be outside the gate.
Right.
But the fact is, the issue is she can't really control her son Joffrey on the throne, right? He basically does whatever he feels like doing, and I think that's the biggest problem, is that the Lannisters have a game plan of how to basically carry their name into the future, and Joffrey is just doing his own thing, and he doesn't really care that much about the game plan,
Right.
So that's going to be the conflict, right?
Indeed. Just a couple moments that I wanted to point out within this scene that are just fantastic. When he says, yes, quite, when Cersei says, I did nothing. And then Tyrion's like, oh, quite right. You did nothing. And then now the North is risen up against us, all because of that bit of theater will haunt our family for generations. And then when he's like, we have 2 Stark girls to train. And then Cersei's like, 1. And Tyrion's eyes just bulge. And he's like,
yeah,
what?
Well, it's
what?
you beheaded one Stark.
You let the other
lost the other.
It's like, how does it feel to be the disappointing child? Which is just so satisfying on so many different levels for Tyrion, for this to be like the one moment where Tyrion finally gets the vindication where he knows he's right and he can shit all over his sister. I feel like every person that's ever had that one sibling that always shat on them and then finally gets that one chance to get their revenge, it's just, I feel like that was validation for all of those people that watched the show at that moment. But so that's really the only big Tyrion moment that happens before we get to, the it scene. At the end, I think he has one other scene with Shay, and it's like, oh, okay. It's kind of just to remind us, it's like, oh yeah, Shay's here, and Shay's still a character.
Yeah, bringing Shay into the capital, the fact that they have to be careful and cautious because basically we're foreshadowing that something's going to take place with them targeting Shay.
Right. So then I'm going to speed through these next couple of plot lines because these plot lines for the most part are really just quick setups, like quick blink or you miss it. So we have Winterfell. Bran is now kind of acting ruler along with Maester Luwin. He's kind of, learning what it's like to rule, learning how to deal with the, the comings and goings of just regular peasants and everything, but clearly not. And is starting to learn that it's just kind of more of a reminder that the high and mighty status of the lords is just a reminder that there is actual real just everyday shit that people have to deal with and that the lords have to kind of
Dom, I think one of the big things that takes place during this episode is giving us characterization about the North, because a lot of what takes place is this idea that the North necessarily they band together and they gave their promise to the Stark name, but they're not necessarily all 100% on the same page.
Right.
And I think we start to see sort of, that idea where it's this one guy is like, I can't fix my, castle or whatever it is. I can't fix my home because I sent all our men down to war. And basically he doesn't even respect Robb as king of the North. And he has to be reminded Robb is the king of the North. And so it's one of those things where there are cracks within the Bannermen, and that's going to be a big part of what happens forward with this whole sort of war of multiple kings, is that the North is not as solidified and together as they thought.
Absolutely. It's going to result, obviously, once we see Theon invade the North later on in the season, once we see Bran and Rickon have to go on the run, and we see how that affects Robb even down in the Riverlands later on after this season, later on in the season as well, and kind of the fracturing of the North. And that sequence ends with Bran with Osha and Hodor in the woods, and them going to the pool with Osha figuring out about more of Bran's weird trees, and weird dreams, and of course we see the first shot of something that a lot of people, and I just in general, I feel like has been forgotten about as time went on, but I remember it was a pretty big deal when I read the book, obviously, that season 2 is based off of, right? We're now on book 2, A Clash of Kings, as far as that goes, which is the shot of the red comet that's floating across the sky. And I remember a big thing, obviously, when the book started is this kind of uniting everyone, but also, just reflecting the nature of Game of Thrones, which is that kind of similar to which is like similar to like the White Walkers setting up the overwhelming loom. Now we have the fire from the comets, which a lot of people take to be different meanings. A lot of people think, oh, it means this person's going to be king. It's going to be this person to be king. But I think Osha is the one that really nails the meaning of it, which is that it signifies that something is back in the world that has never been before, which is dragons. And we get two kind of spin-offs of that, right? So then we obviously cut to the only scene in Essos with Daenerys, who along with what's left of her Khalasar and Ser Jorah are just kind of wandering across the Red Waste. And then you wonder, wait, why the hell are they just wandering in the desert away from the free cities? And Jorah kind of gives us a quick recap as far as, okay, if we go in this direction, these people will kill us and take your dragons. If we go in this direction, these people will kill us and take your dragons. We don't really have a whole lot of option. And Daenerys is kind of just running out of hope and realizing, oh yeah, so it's just kind of a reminder of, oh yeah, so this is what happened. This is what it feels like to be powerless again.
Yeah, the red comment is kind of weird because in this episode, it's just used as a transition from that scene with Bran and Odor and whatnot to Daenerys. And, obviously they say, hey, this means a good omen. We're gonna have a big victory against the South. Or the Lannisters, it's their color, so that means they're gonna have a victory. Or it means that there's dragons. Hard cut to the dragons.
Or it could mean all of it, because technically all of those things do happen. The Lannisters do get their victory, but the Starks also manage to get their revenge, and then the dragons return to Westeros, obviously. So technically, if we're going by that logic, just kind of, because the other thing that this episode introduces as well, once we get into the stance of it all, is this idea of prophecies and kind of how they have this warped meaning, and they could have multiple meanings that get into.
Well, I think the red comment is a very interesting thing that I think we're going to be discussing a little bit later, but for the most part, it's in this episode, and then I don't think it really kind of peters out. It doesn't really show up the rest of the series. It sort of is just like one scene, brief meaning into it. So I don't know. You're saying to me that it has a little more impact in the book than it did in the series.
You know what? I can't necessarily say that it did. The whole big thing is I just feel like, because it's when you're reading something versus watching it, I feel like in an adaptation, it just feels like it resonates that much more. And kind of what interests me is kind of how it does, in a way, signify and set up everything that the people do discuss it to, as far as that goes. Kind of just building into the elements of storytelling. Once kind of the primary setup is done, which we got in season 1, now we have, it kind of signifies the beginning of this secondary setup and the secondary storylines that we've got. But before we get to the other big two storylines that occupy the second half of the episode, we do catch up with Jon north of the Wall. Him and the rest of the Night's Watch are going on their expedition north in order to find out what's happened north. Jon has officially made his decision to stay with the Night's Watch, and they arrive at this one place north of the Wall, Craster's Keep, which is run by Craster, a wildling who marries his daughters and then obviously procreates with them in order to create more daughters for him to marry. And it's just an absolute beastly situation, kind of once again a reminder of kind of the lawless nature of the North and everything. And ultimately, the scene is mostly expository as far as kind of introducing us to a new element of what is North of the Wall. We've heard so much about it, but now we're actually going to get to see it over the course of these next couple seasons.
Yeah. And the number one thing that's brought up by basically Jon and the other sort of characters, the other new members of
where his sons,
the Watch. What do they do with the sons? Yeah. It's like,
he can't make all daughters.
Yeah, we're not going to find out this episode necessarily, but we'll find out soon enough. Basically, what happens with the sons, and that's going to be sort of a line, a little bit of a sort of what's happening beyond the wall. Jon sort of starts to piece things together with his friends, and because of that, it's not exactly the Night's Watch is not exactly what he was led to believe it is.
Right. And we're going to get into that. But before we'll get into that, obviously, the rest of the season go. Like I said, this scene is, along with Daenerys and Bran scenes, were mostly just setups for the rest of what's to come. And there's not a whole lot of plot and story that goes on.
Yeah, you're setting up a really bad guy as, someone that the Night's Watch has to deal with this season, because Craster is just this sort of one of the
repugnant, the latest in a line of repugnant human beings that we're introduced to on this show.
Yeah, but the Lord Commander basically sort of kowtows to him. It's like, you're letting us stay in your house, and it's your rules, etc. And it's to the point where it's like, Craster basically likes that axe. Well, we're going to give you that axe because we really need your assistance to, be able to explore up here. We're going to need your shelter. We're going to need your fire. We're going to need your, potential food if we run out. And so Craster's Keep is really a supply line for the, Night's Watch. And it sets that up as sort of, he's someone that they tolerate because it helps them sort of figure out what their missions are beyond the wall to begin with.
Absolutely. And, of course, he states that he gives some crucial pieces of information here before they leave, which is that, of course, he hasn't seen Benjen Stark in months, but that he knows that the wildlings around the area have all left to go north in order to join with Mance Rayder, because I believe this is the first mention of him, the King Beyond the Wall, who is also revealed to be a former Night's Watch member, as Mormont reveals, when Craster makes a jab at him, and that they are planning to attack south. That is the big thing that is revealed here. So now we get into the second half of the episode, which is where we get our two big storylines. Obviously, we have the continuation of Robb from the Riverlands, but first we get into the introduction of our focus character and a brand new character and a brand new sect of the story and the world of Westeros. We heard about him. He was the only Baratheon sibling that we did not see last season. We heard about him a lot. He was mentioned a lot as having this incredible battle prowess, but in this next sequence, we officially meet Robert's middle brother, Stannis Baratheon, portrayed by Stephen Delane. He is our focus character of the segments. We're going to talk about him for a little bit here.
Yeah, Dom, this is a fantastic setup.
Fantastic. I love
basically
it. It's one
on
of my
the
favorite
beach.
Character introductions.
Yeah, they're on the beach. They're basically worshiping the Lord of Light, who we're being introduced to for the first time. They're basically burning the idols of the old gods. And, here comes this one member, right? Just someone within the kingdom of Stannis riding in and being like, have you really forsaken the old gods? Like, what are you doing? Why are you burning them? And it's this whole ceremony that's set up to basically push out, their family gods and accept this new god. And Stannis walks into this really, bizarre setup fire ceremony and takes a sword from it. And it's one of those things that's very interesting is they introduce Melisandre, the Red Witch, and it's one of those things where she is telling Stannis that he has this destiny to basically be on the throne, and he just has to basically team up with the Lord of Light to do so. And it's one of those things where this ceremony seems legit, but also at the same time,
there's an underlying air of sinisterism there.
Yeah, well, it seems set up, right? Because it's like, oh, hey, we're burning these idols and we set up a sword in the middle of it. Go grab your sword. Like, is that really what the Lord of Light wants Stannis to do? Is that really how he wants him to claim his sword? Or is this sort of the witch whispering in his ear and sort of convincing him to adopt the god? And,
right.
It's really just all a show. It's a stage. And I think that's one of the things that's very interesting about the Lord of Light is we don't really know anything about his powers. It's really just a spectacle. Exactly. And, I think we're going to learn more about his powers as the show goes on.
It's very interesting because the way that Stannis is introduced, it's almost like the antithesis of what we've heard, right? Because we've heard all of these different interesting things last season, like from Ned and from Renly. Obviously, once it was revealed that like Stannis is supposed to be the rightful heir to the throne, and Renly even says it, like Renly and Littlefinger both bring up the idea no one wants Stannis on the throne, nobody. And in this scene, we're kind of shown it, which is really awesome because it could be so easy to be like, oh, this is to have like somebody like Davos Seaworth, who's a character that we're also introduced to that seemingly has a. It's interesting how every time I go back and rewatch season 2, it's interesting to me how, for what a character that Davos Seaworth becomes as time goes on, he really doesn't have as much to do, I feel like, as we would think, kind of, as we later learn, that he is kind of Stannis' conscience and Stannis' voice of reason. In fact, it was the two things that Martin was attempting to accomplish with this sequence in the books was to establish kind of a voice for Stannis, which is why he has all the Stannis chapters narrated by Davos Seaworth, and also to kind of introduce the idea of this cultish religion, because we'd heard, obviously, coming out of the first season, we only knew of the old gods and the new gods, obviously, of Westeros, but now we're starting to learn about some other of these religions, and in this sequence, it's perfectly utilized in order to kind of show Stannis. Stannis is a man who, throughout his entire life, has felt like he's been passed over, right? He says even in this season, he never felt any love towards Robert or Renly. Robert never felt any love towards him personally. He was always very strict, very honor-bound, very rigid, and that's probably what drove a big wedge between Robert, because Robert, as we know, was always very, big and blustery and fun and wanted to go out and party, and Stannis was kind of like, the ne'er-do-well kid who always probably had, like, really good intentions, but just was never given a chance to prove himself, and has done so multiple times, kind of been done dirty on the end of the stick. His two big famous moments, obviously, in the recent histories were in the rebellion of the Mad King. Stannis actually almost had a moment where he wasn't sure whether to side with Robert or whether to side with King Aerys, and eventually he sided with Robert, and he held Storm's End, the Baratheon ancestral home, during a siege by the Tyrells, in which they were almost completely starved out. And it was actually because of Davos Seaworth that they were able to withstand it, as Davos was able to smuggle in onions, which is why Stannis obviously has a gives him a place in his court as well. The other obviously big moment was during the Greyjoy Rebellion, when Stannis' fleet destroyed the Greyjoy fleet. So Stannis, he's an experienced battle commander, right? And so he's always seemed like that one character that on paper has all the makings of a great king. He's an excellent experienced battle commander. He has a way of unifying men. He's firm and knows what he wants, but also is incredibly just, and as well, unlike Ned Stark, knows how to play the game, as he states later on, knows how to play the game.
I was about to say, basically, Stannis is sort of like Ned Stark on steroids, so to speak.
Yeah,
like, basically has the same...
It's Ned Stark if he had less sympathy and a better understanding of the game.
Yeah, exactly. It's like he understands the game, and he's just ready to play it. And Ned is has this certain honor, this sort of tradition about being a warrior in the field. But Ned is was separated in the North, whereas Stannis sort of grew up in the mix, and he understands that there's threats at every angle.
Right.
Ned, for whatever reason, sort of was isolated and came back into it, and just didn't realize how far it had come from the days of the rebellion.
Exactly, and Stannis, what's it called? And there's another example of how Stannis has kind of been done dirty is that when Robert was doling out, castles to rule when he became king, rather than giving Stannis Storm's End as he was the next in line, he gave Stannis control over Dragonstone, the original ancestral home of the Targaryens for when they originally touched down in Westeros to rule over, which at that point was a ruin, and then gave Renly control over Storm's End. So, and that's kind of why they're situated there. The other big moment, obviously, like I said, is Maester Crescent, because this sequence was actually the prologue sequence for the second book of Clash of Kings, in which Maester Crescent tries to come out, urges them to, remember their old gods, and then, states to Davos, like Melisandre, she's telling Stannis what he wants, but at the end, she will be his doom. And once again, more foreshadowing as far as what's to come with him. And then he attempts to make the move, during kind of their big council sit down. As far as, trying to stop a bad thing before it happens, because the whole thing is Maester Crescent is not only Stannis, but also Robert and Renly's Maester from when they were children. So he's kind of seen them all grow up. So he's seen he has this familial connection to them. And so he's trying to, in his eyes, prevent something that is only going to lead Stannis down a dark path. But unfortunately, it is all for naught, because Melisandre proves that she is way more than just show here by drinking the wine, obviously. It's always interesting to me what they do with Melisandre, because they set her up as a character who could be all for show and could just have her own motivation. But as time goes on, you do learn, no, there are some actual powers to this woman. And it's kind of, I think it's really interestingly shown as time goes on throughout the season, kind of her wavering allegiance and as far as, kind of her motivation behind the Lord of Light. But the big moments, obviously, to take away from that big sit down.
Well, I'm just going to say, the whole poisoning scene where he goes and he sort of says, hey, let's drink to this. And here's your cup, here's mine. And it's the same wine. And he's really willing to sacrifice himself. And basically he starts sort of bleeding from the nose and whatnot. And she's perfectly fine. She actually takes the wine and downs it even more. And so, she does have some sort of ability, at least the ability to resist poison of whatever kind this is. And I think that's a really smart scene to show that, not only is she sort of a religious figure and converting Stannis, but she also seems to have some sort of resistance to poison. So maybe there is some truth to power behind the Lord of Light.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of, I love this too because it's also shown as again a very visual and forthcoming scene in a way in which to show this is the beginning of like kind of these different religions that we're going to be introduced to. Obviously, as we become used to the drowned god that the Iron Islanders worshipped and the many-faced god that the Bravosi and the faceless men worship, and so many different gods, so many different religions that we're introduced to, kind of the effect that has on people. It's a more underrated aspect, I think, of the show as it goes forward. But the final scene, obviously, in which Stannis literally states, Ned Stark tried to keep this a secret. I will not make the same mistake. In which he writes a letter basically exposing Joffrey and his siblings' true parentage to all the High Lords of Westeros. But another crucial scene that is revealed about Stannis before we kind of end this segment, end our focus character segment as far as that goes, is that Stannis is a hard man and a just man, but he is not necessarily a fair man, because as Davos urges him, Renly is your brother, and Robb Stark shares a common cause with you. As far as that goes, you could ally with them against them, and Stannis is very curt. He's like, Renly is conspiring against me in order to try and steal my throne, and Robb Stark conspires to take away half my kingdom. If they are nothing more than thieves, and if they get in my way, I will destroy them. And it just kind of shows that it's ultimately Stannis' fatal flaw, and ultimately the thing that will eventually get him killed is this idea that when he is dead set on something, he is so dead set on it that nothing will get in his way, not even things that could potentially help him. Because again, that was always a point that kind of baffled me. I'm like, all three of these guys, I'm like, Renly, Robb, and Stannis all have common cause. I'm like, Stannis wants the throne because he's owed it. Robb just wants independence and wants justice for Ned, and Renly probably has the least amount of cause and claim to the throne, because he's just trying to get attention and prove himself a man and prove himself mature. But the three of them do have common cause, and it's again the brilliance of the show and the story, because it's just the fact that these three cannot get their shit together and cannot ally together, which is what eventually causes, at least for the time being, the Lannister victory.
Yeah, well, Renly is one of those characters that he's short-lived in this season. But, spoiler alert, I guess. But the fact is, Renly actually knows how to play the game because he's been in Robert's court and closely connected to it. And he understands, what's at play in King's Landing and abroad. Whereas Stannis is sort of isolated. He's doing his own thing. And he's this old war commander that no one really sort of believes is, really involved. He's sort of an outsider at this point. So Renly is trying to basically go in there and push out Stannis, and he has the ability to, because he has a lot of bannermen that they share, the Baratheon bannermen, and he sort of convinces them to his side. So Renly is one of those people that knows how to play the game. He actually knew it in season 1 when he tried to get Ned to team up with him and basically overthrow the Lannisters, and that didn't go so well because Ned did not believe in playing the game, which basically meant that Renly had to flee the city, which led to Ned Stark's dying. And now Renly still knows how to play the game. He has a lot of people backing him, and probably more than Stannis really has. Right. And it's one of those things where even though Stannis is like, you're my younger brother, and you should bend the knee to me, Renly understands how to play the game, and he knows that he has outfoxed Stannis. And so it's just a matter of time for Renly to really, basically repel Stannis and then really achieve what he wants. And so I think this is going to be a key thing, that the fact that the two Baratheons are fighting and having this like real sibling war, this is going to really bode well for the Lannisters as we see throughout the season.
Absolutely. And we're going to see that continue to play out as far as that goes. And the last major storylines, that's just so you guys know, that's the end roughly of the focused character segment. So the last big thing that we have for this episode is, of course, the Riverlands plot. Robb, this is so last season, obviously the season finale, we saw him obviously get crowned King of the North, but this premiere episode just shows Robb is ready to move. Robb is ready to start making some moves. He is ready. He is fully what's it called? He has fully accepted the mantle of King of the North, and he is fully ready to make some power moves here. His first move, obviously, is once he's received the letter. Once again, another infamous moment where we do just another time jump where he receives the letter, he interrogates Jaime, he kind of fills in the gaps. Obviously, the Catelyn was kind of unable to get in her interrogation of Jaime in the last season finale, where he says, what's it called? He says, Joffrey doesn't really have a claim to the throne because he's your bastard son, and that's why you pushed Bran out the window, because he caught you too. And Jaime, of course, tries to repel it and says, you have proof, but Robb once again states that, Robb once again in that scene proves that he is no fool, and he understands that, the value that Jaime has, but what he has to do in order to, kind of keep Jaime under a tight leash and keep his bannermen under a tight leash. And so he states to Jaime that he's going to send Jaime's cousin, Sir Alton Lannister, south with his peace terms, which of course include, the return of Ned's bones, the return of Sansa and Arya safely, and the full independence of the North. If you think about it, rather reasonable terms, as far as that goes. He doesn't really necessarily want to wage this war. Obviously, Ned's dead, so the whole, kind of campaign to, rescue him has failed. If he just gets Sansa and Arya back and they get the independence that they want, that kind of frees up the Lannisters to deal with Robert's brother. So logistically, his terms really aren't the worst, but of course, just because of pride and ego and just so many things that have happened now that just can't be fixed, obviously, we know that will not happen. After, obviously, the scene where he sends Sir Alton south, of course, we get the next big moment with Theon, who finally starts to come into his own a little bit. Obviously, Theon refers to him as Your Grace. These two, obviously, they still have their brotherly bond, which is where Theon urges him, the Lannisters are never going to accept your peace terms. The only way you're going to win this war is by taking King's Landing, and if you do that, you're going to need ships. My father has ships, and so this is where, now that kind of Robb has taken over of the mantle of head of the Starks in Ned's place, this is where kind of the beginning of Robb's downfall begins. We already saw technically the second step, right? We saw the beginning of it last season with him being forced into this deal with the devil with Walder Frey, and now we see the second stage of it with him trusting and sending Theon away to the Iron Islands to attempt to convince his father, Balon Greyjoy, to ally his cause to Robb. An action that Catelyn strongly opposes because she remembers Balon Greyjoy, and she knows and she remembers how he upstaged the minute that he was given just even an ounce. He tried to start a rebellion, and that he is untrustworthy, but Robb ultimately shushes her up and then states his decision that he is now sending her south in order to try and recruit Renly to their side as well. He's not even bothering with Stannis. Pat, how do you think Robb's doing so far as King of the North with the next of, obviously?
It's Robb does a really good job, except for when it comes to dealing with Walder Frey and the Greyjoys, right? Because it's so clear, if from watching this show and watching it again, that these families are so untrustworthy.
There's
no way.
It's one of those Sons of Anarchy things where I don't know how anyone gets anything done, because I feel like after a certain point, just nobody would trust each other.
Yeah, but like Walder Frey is known as the person that never shows up, or whatever the phrasing is.
Lord Frey, as he's called.
Yeah, exactly. So like, he's not even trusted to basically honor his banners or his promises, but yet we trust him. We make this deal to marry, some of his daughters. Then, obviously that leads to the Red Wedding, but the fact is, like, Walder Frey was like an enemy really from the start of this. And they didn't treat him like that. They treated him as someone that they could sort of pay off, or they sort of, could make deals with. And they never really thought like, hey, the other side might have a better offering for them, and they might actually take it. The Greyjoys, again, they tried to rebel before against the Starks and were put down. And if you know anything about the Greyjoys from watching this show, it's that they're proud people, and being put down is not something they're going to stand for. They're going to pay the iron price. So the fact is that Robb really doesn't know this, or wasn't taught this, but I feel like the education in the North, specifically for the Lords of Winterfell, was pretty high. So I don't understand, really what Robb's thinking when he tries to get the Greyjoys involved, because, if anything, there's reason to not trust them, even more than the Freys, not trusting the Freys.
To me, it's an ultimate sign that he was just a child that was raised during peacetime. And he was raised in this era where, again, he was too young. He was born during the rebellion against the Iron Throne. He was a young child when the Greyjoy rebellion happened. So it's just a matter of the majority of his life has been peace, and now that he's all of a sudden been thrust into this conflict, right? He's ready, obviously, to wage war. The problem is, right now, he's only got the one direction, right? Which is, I feel like, again, in a weird way, kind of an avatar for the audience, where he's got this one blind side. It's like, get to the Lannisters, stop the Lannisters, that he doesn't really take into account the fact that, yeah, these other families have, wants and desires and ambition as well. It's not just the Lannisters. It's ultimately, it's this fact that I think really does set season 2 as a whole apart, is this idea of taking what we thought was going to be this back and forth conflict, between the Starks and the Lannisters. The Starks is the good guys and the Lannisters are the bad guys. And season 2 throws in all of these different struggles. Oh, the other Baratheons are not going to be the same as Robert. They're not going to be in their corner. Okay, now we've got the Greyjoys. Now we've got the Freys. Soon enough, we're going to be introduced to the Tyrells, and we've got all of these different factors that are coming in. And you start to find, it expands the scope of all the families in a way that really the characters just don't seem to understand, because they're coming off of 10 years of peace, because it has been 10 years since the Greyjoy Rebellion. So as far as that goes, it kind of makes sense as far as why Robb seems to think that everyone that's kind of not a Lannister is kind of in their court, He's got the right thinking with Renly as far as that goes, but, we don't know this at the time, but obviously once Cat arrives at Renly's camp in order to negotiate with him, but he clearly doesn't have this thought process or understanding, really, about the Greyjoys, and we're going to see it come back to bite him in a bad way, obviously, once Theon goes what he goes through in this season and makes the choices that he goes through in this season as well, ultimately.
Yeah,
so,
I really think this is worse for Theon than it is for Robb. But
yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Because it sets up Theon to be abducted by Ramsay later on. So it's the beginning of it's good to know that in the first episode, Robb's first mainstay is kind of the new Stark in charge, and he's already up to fucking up somehow even worse than his dad did, because we all know Ned's decision making in King's Landing last season was pretty damn poor, but it already shows that Robb is kind of setting him up for something that's so much worse here. But we have one major sequence left, of course, which is probably one of the most despicable things that I think has ever been put to television. Like, we've seen a lot of fucked up shit, or at the time when this episode aired, there have been a lot of screwed up shit that have been portrayed on TV, and there was a lot of screwed up shit that was yet to come, just in this show. But this is one of the worst, where after an amazing sequence in which Cersei, strong arms Littlefinger into trying to track down Arya, in which Littlefinger attempts to, show that he has some leverage over Cersei, and Cersei immediately shows him, no. You're not the one in charge here.
The argument is, knowledge is power, and then Cersei's retort is power is power. And I think that's a pretty interesting dynamic, and just seeing, how the two view things, because Lord Baelish could have easily been put out of his misery just by a whim that Cersei had. And so ultimately she did have power that was even more important than whatever knowledge Lord Baelish thinks he had.
Right, absolutely. And it ultimately ends with Cersei then going to confront Joffrey as he's having some renovations done on the throne room, trying to make it look more like the Targaryens and embody them as like, yeah, they were conquerors. And, of course, Cersei is she is trying so hard. I feel so bad. It's really hard to make me feel bad for a character like Cersei Lannister, but this one episode really does make me feel bad. First off, for her being one-upped by Tyrion, which we know is just the last thing that she would ever want, and then her slowly realization that Joffrey, now that he is king, is not going to be as easily controlled as he was when he was just a prince, which is that she, of course, tries to get him to focus up and try and find Arya because she knows that he's the preference, but he really doesn't seem to take that seriously. He's like, let her die as far as that goes. Who actually cares? Once again, him refusing to understand the game and him refusing to really understand the value of the player that she has. But then, of course, because we know that Joffrey is only motivated by things that, piss him off and petty little things. He of course, obviously, like everyone else now in Westeros, has received Stannis' letter. And, like he said, as he quote unquote, the disgusting lie about his mother and Uncle Jaime. Quick question, because I always wondered this, and I wanted to throw this past someone. Do you think, because again, this just shows the power of the performances that these actors give, right? With the expression that Jack Leeson is giving in his performance in this specific moment, obviously he has to say that it's a lie in order to kind of preserve their whole status quo and everything, in order to preserve their kind of stance and their piece of the pie that they have right now in this war that's about to happen. But do you think that Joffrey suspects that there might be some truth to obviously, the incest statement that Stannis has just now made public knowledge for the entire kingdom?
For the most part, I think Joffrey probably accepts that, and it's like, hey, this is my throne. I have it. I'm sitting on it. So I feel like he's not necessarily like worried too much about, the game that's being played. And so he probably just dismisses it. But at the same time, he's saying like, this is our throne. Like they can say whatever they want. So Is it sort of like a teenager just sort of, ignoring that and just calling it what it is, which is sort of a misinformation tactic? Or does he just really not care? It's like they have the power, they have the throne. That's all that matters. It doesn't really matter what his origin is. I think either one of those is acceptable in terms of Joffrey's mindset. One of the things I think is great, though, in this scene is when Cersei basically slaps him across the face.
When he's literally just rubbing in her face. He's just like, how many women was father having sex with? And she just belts him across the face. It's like, no, I've heard enough of that shit.
It sets up the whole, thing with the bastards, but also it's one of those things where Joffrey's just like little, like screaming like a girl moments whenever he gets slapped by somebody.
I don't even know how to classify that kind of noise. It's like the perfect amount of just like petulant and pathetic, but like that just shows like the inner like child and that he really is, that he's trying so hard to like cover up with like this veneer of just cynicism and psychopathy.
Yeah, it's every time that it comes out, it's perfect, and I think Tyrion gets another whack in later in the season.
Oh, Tyrion gets a couple. Tyrion gets a couple good ones in this season.
Yeah, it's one of, and then it's the great part about Joffrey because Tyrion does this throughout the second season because this is really Tyrion's rise to power and being a really good hand of the king, and essentially at the end of this season and into the next season. Basically Tywin comes into town and he actually has a lot of good quips against Joffrey during his time in King's Landing. So Joffrey really has this like hard exterior, like brutal king making bad decisions. But when, Tyrion has his power and concentrates it and knows what to do with it, and Tywin knows what to do with it, Joffrey just really is not a contender. He doesn't know how to really defeat them. Yep. And it's interesting to just watch him sort of snivel at their feet.
It's a line that I've heard in a movie before, and I can't fucking remember what movie it's from, and it's pissing me off. You might know it. It's a line that some character says, like, and I can't even give the context. I just know the line, which is that you were never even a player to begin with. And I feel like that perfectly applies to Joffrey, where the only thing that's propping him up right now is kind of his position that he's solidified for himself in King's Landing. But in every other sense of the word, it's like everyone kind of knows. This even sets up kind of the fact that like even the common people kind of begin to understand, yeah, Joffrey not only is not a good king, but he's not even our rightful king. And I feel like that's kind of solidified by his actions, specifically his one final action, which is response, obviously, to Stannis' letter and kind of solidifying, we're on the throne now, which is his order for the City Watch to go and promptly murder all of the rest of Robert's bastards. And they even say that Robert has like some 14 or 15 bastards just in King's Landing alone. And we see quite a rather brutal and just kind of detestable scene in which several, because it's not even really enough adults. They're all children, just all being promptly murdered. It even starts off, obviously, with the baby that we saw from last season that Ned visited in the brothel shortly before he was attacked by Jaime is brutally murdered. It's really a disturbing scene. And
this sequence has a lot of parallels in my mind to the that sequence in Breaking Bad when sort of Walt is orchestrating. Oh yeah,
when Walt orchestrates the murders of everyone across all different jails.
Exactly. Yeah. So like obviously this is totally different because we're attacking bastard children, but the fact is we're cutting from different areas. We're seeing the brothel baby be murdered.
Really well done as far as editing goes.
Yeah, exactly. And it ends with basically the blacksmith having his head held to the coals, telling us where is this boy, what's his name, and it's like, oh, it's Gendry. It's like you'll know him by his bull helmet he made for himself. And then it's like they let him go and it cuts to Gendry jumping on the cart, hanging out with Arya, and they're going off on the King's Road. And then it hits the credits, and it's like, that's a really good start to the season because we now know that, what Joffrey's doing, what, King's Landing is going to be chasing after Gendry. but because Gendry is with Arya, then that puts her at risk, and we sort of, instantly understand that the two of them are sort of tied together, that they got to escape King's Landing. They got to get as far away as possible. And they're going to have to stick together if they're going to really outchase the Kingsman.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic premiere episode. It sets up all of, I think, the struggles that are going to come throughout this season, both for the characters that have big moments in this episode and small moments. And it sets up, I think, a much more fast pace, we'll say, and a lot more action-oriented than, say, the first season did. So the last thing I want to leave you with before we dive into kind of our last segment, which is the Gotchaverse segment, because I just want to talk a little bit more about that comment and kind of what it signifies for things to come, which is, do you think this is better or worse than the pilot episode?
I think
as far as a premiere goes. Obviously, again, it's really weird because, pilots are pilots, that's one thing, but just as like a premiere episode.
I think this episode really sets up the second season, and, it gets us interested, and we understand sort of what is happening, what wheels are turning, and it sort of just pulls you in, I think, right away. I think the first episode of the first season is something that sort of pulls you in, but I think, in terms of like a brand new show, some things are sort of predictable. It's a lot of exposition. It's like, it's not as clear cut what's going to happen in the rest of the season. It's really taking you by the hand over the course of the first few episodes. I think in season 2, this episode starts you off with like, all right, let's recap a little bit, but like this is where we're going. And it's pretty clear sort of the lines that we're following with the different characters from this point going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah, because that's the thing that I want to do going forward is kind of this, like, it's a thing that I was doing with my Sopranos rewatch as well, which is I want to see, like, kind of how all of the premiere episodes compare to each other, how all of the penultimate episodes, which are, like, the big end-all, be-all action set-piece episodes compare to each other, and how all the finales compare to each other. So now we have our first two. Obviously, the premiere Winter is Coming and the North Remember. So we'll keep track of that going forward. Now, before we get out of here, obviously, this comment, right? Because it's a thing that is briefly hinted at and really only uses a transition in this episode, but within the books themselves is kind of used as this thing to signify like greater things to come, right? Because there's a lot that happens in A Clash of Kings that also sets up future things to come. There's a lot more characters that are introduced, a lot more players into the game, right? We have the birth of Daenerys' dragons, who, even though they're still relatively little, will come to play a big part in the trajectory. We also have kind of the introduction of the prophecy, right? Another big thing of Melisandre within this episode is kind of her examination of the Azor Ahai plot, which is, kind of the light bringer, the guy who will, save the world from the great other, because that's the other instance that's kind of interesting about the whole Lord of Light religion. It's kind of, the mixing of the fire half of the Song of Ice and Fire aspect, which is that we'll have both the dragons who could breathe fire, and we'll have the Lord of Light, where the Lord of Light is kind of used to signify this figure that will overcome the great darkness, which at first it seemed to assume just like the players in front of us, but is later revealed to be obviously the White Walkers and kind of the overall looming threat that they pose. But I don't know, Pat, like, what do you kind of make of this whole idea of kind of what this comet represents, as far as like, because the interesting thing about Game of Thrones is that it very much gets into this idea of prophecies not really being this overwhelming end-all be-all thing, but really more so just kind of subjective depending on which person reads into it.
Hey, this comment means nothing to me. I hate to be honest. Listen, hey, it's a pretty cool scene, to have this comet in the sky, and it sparks up a nice little debate between Osha and Bran, but ultimately it's like it's quickly used as a transition, and it's like, oh, hey, it means the coming of dragons. Cut to baby dragons, and so I think the show really undercuts it a little bit. It doesn't bring it back in any of the rest of the episode or the rest of the series. It's sort of just a quick scene, comment. It's like, oh, well, the books have the comment, so let's have it here. I don't necessarily think it really plays a big role, at least in the TV series. So I don't know. You tell me. You read the books.
Well, I think just as a sort of like
it seems like it has a bigger impact in the books than it does here in the TV series.
I find, from what I remember, it's a thing that it's so bright that I think they even see a glimpse of it north of the wall. Although I'm not sure. And the whole thing is that it's supposed to kind of act as kind of this looming overall force, as kind of like, okay, so that we thought that there was going to be this one overwhelming thing. Now there's going to be this other thing that is kind of introduced. You know, if season 1 introduces the ice element, that season 2 introduces the fire element, and this is going to be like kind of the push, this almost the symbolic push-pull back and forth, you know, that is then obviously butchered along with many other things by the finale. So before we get out of here, just wanted to, of course, give a shout out to a couple of our commenters. Eric, good to have you back. I pulled up a couple of his comments, but I did want to bring up one other comment, which I think is another thing that I feel like a lot of people agree with. But just, yeah, I do find that seasons 2 and 3 most of the time do kind of blend together more than any other seasons.
Yeah, I would agree, because like I can binge watch season 2 and 3 all in like one weekend. It is fantastic. It just keeps going and going and going, and it's all fantastic.
Absolutely, yes. And then we have a newcomer, Miss Cub, who commented, "I need to be drunk to deal with Joffrey too." Yeah, that's a very
well. I don't know if drinking around Joffrey is a good thing.
Stannis the Menace, and Eric also brought up, would love to see a spinoff about the Lord of Light himself, as to finally find out what his or her deal is really about. Honestly, I'm down with that. I'm always down to explore more of the mythological elements of anything.
Only if Jeff Bridges can play the Lord of Light.
I'm down with that, honestly. Like, we got Jeffrey Wright voicing Watcher the Watcher in the upcoming What If. I would definitely be down for that. Miss Cobb also commented, "Not good allies," to our allies comment before. Yeah. I feel like Downey Jr. needs to be in that scene to just be like, not a great plan as far as that goes. Another thing that they brought up, Janos Slint is just the worst. Yes, absolutely. We're going to see him get his in the next episode, definitely. But, yeah, that was pretty much it for comments. Now, of course, the only thing that we end with, is the thing that we end every episode with, which is, of course, the death count, obviously. So we had a lot of deaths in this episode, but I'm going to kind of...
Some guy got thrown off the top of the building.
We have the knight at the beginning of the episode who was brutally murdered by the Hound and chucked off, and we obviously saw him get dragged away, and we just saw like the blood just leave the stain on there as he was getting dragged away. We have the death of Maester Crescent when he kills himself, obviously, with the poison unintentionally, and then of course it ends
all the bastards.
All the bastards. Just like there's like 14 or 15 kids that just all get brutally murdered, and then leaves only like 2 of Robert's bastards like alive. Well, really 1, because Edric Storm is not a character in the show. They kind of mix Edric Storm just into Gendry. So without further ado, people, that's it. We're officially back, people. 9 more episodes to go for season 2, and then we'll have another season in the books. Pat, I hope you're ready, because there is going to be a lot to cover as this season goes on.
Yeah, I think we're back in the swing of things, and I think the Talkin TV audience remembers how this is done.
Absolutely. Yeah. Are you kidding me? They never forgot. They were our memory for it ultimately. And I can't wait ultimately to cover what I think at the end of the day, once we eventually do the rankings of all the seasons, is going to turn out to be one of the better seasons. You know, obviously we know it's between this season, season 4, and season 6 for the best season ultimately. And so I think we're definitely going to, you know, kind of continue to see the effects of that as this season goes on. But Pat, before we get out of here, where can the good people find you?
Hey, listen, I just direct everybody to my Instagram at Patrick W. Huber, Huber, and I'll post on there someday. You know, right now I'm just sort of doing other things, but I feel like I'm taking photos, I'm going to do some edits, and I'll probably post at some point in life.
Absolutely. And you guys know what to do here. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Talkin TV Podcast. Also, be sure to click the subscribe button, click the like button, click the bell next to it so you guys get notified every time we put up new content. New episodes of Talkin' Thrones are going to be uploaded every Sundays. We'll be live going forward for the foreseeable future, unless something happens, which, of course, we'll let you know about that. But we'll see you next week for episode 12 of Talkin' Thrones, season 2, episode 2, The Nightlands. But in the meantime, you guys know what to do. Stay frosty, stay cool, stay hot. 12 seasons in a short film. And watch more fucking movies. We'll see you guys next week.